Towards the end of the 1990s, Apple's reinvention of the Macintosh shook the entire world. Not only did they make PCs more easy to use and exciting, but also took them into the future. But what if you could take that future with you? Anywhere you went, with no sacrifices, no costs, no compromises. Apple answered this question in July of 1999 with the release of their sister product, which they called the iBook. Advertised as the iMac to go, iBook was a massive success. It was the device for those who wanted to extend their digital life beyond just the bedroom or office. Computers were no longer just a utility, they were a part of you. iBook personified this in ways that were familiar, bold, and unconventional. It literally had a handle at the top so that you could easily carry it with you and make a statement while doing it, as its unapologetically vibrant and strange appearance did all the talking. It ran without a fan, had excellent battery life, a satisfyingly smooth trackpad, a wide range of delicious and glossy colors to choose from, and a revolutionary new way to connect to the internet without any cables. This was called Wi-Fi, which Apple adapted through their new technology called Airport. It didn't matter where you were, the internet was right there with you, encased in a beautiful plastic clamshell. iBook was a trailblazer in many ways, but it is also retrospectively looked at as one of the strangest looking computers of the 90s. Its futuristic, almost otherworldly appearance was unlike anything else from its time, and arguably anything else after it. iBook was not just a computer. It was a conversation, and by understanding its development, marketing, and innovations that made its influence and great technological feat possible, that conversation gets so much more interesting. Hickory dickory hock, my mouse runs down the dock, and it finds a rather curious application. It may just be the one you've been looking for. Obscura VPN. Did you know that your online activity is being watched? Not just by me. Tons of people are watching it. ISPs, coffee shops, governments, many of them are even using this information for their own benefit. If they aren't selling it, then it may just end up getting leaked by hackers. But with Obscura VPN, have no fear. Not only is privacy built in by design, unlike a lot of traditional VPNs who effectively act as a middleman that can still see your activity, Obscura encrypts everything on their end as well. Not even they can see your online activity, making it much more difficult for potential hackers to obtain it. Their mission is to fight for an open and private internet. It is also incredibly easy to set up. You don't even need an email address to make an account. All you need is to save a special account number and you're ready to go. Just a couple of clicks and your online activity and location is encrypted. You can also change your location if you so desire. Obscura also uses a special protocol that blends your activity with the rest of the internet, which allows it to continue working where other VPNs traditionally get blocked. And of course, Obscura is open source, giving users full transparency into how it's all done. And if you want a privacy-first VPN, go to obscura.com/squid or scan the QR code to get 20% off your subscription. That is only $6 a month. Did you do it yet? I don't think so, because I can still see you. I like that red shirt you're wearing, John. Do it! Sign up for Obscura VPN. To really understand the kind of impact that iBook had on the market, we first need to look at where Apple was as a company around the time the iMac was first released. As we have talked about before on this channel, Apple was really struggling throughout most of the 90s. They were hugely overshadowed by the massive popularity of Microsoft's Windows 95, and frankly, lost a huge amount of that creative spark they had with Steve Jobs after he left the company, or was fired, depending on whose side you're on. Apple was a shadow of its former self, essentially rehashing the same decrepit software and hardware from the decade before, with minimal updates and inspiration. They were bleeding money. So they ultimately hired Steve Jobs back on as interim CEO after acquiring his company Next, and Jobs got the company working on the project that would reinvent the Macintosh. Of course, this would become the iMac, which was not only completely different from its Macintosh predecessors, but it was completely different from any other computer on the market at the time. It was minimalist, quick, and easy to set up, and just drop-dead gorgeous. It gave Apple a huge financial buffer to start turning things around and to potentially even lead the world into the millennium. They wanted to further ride the wave of the iMac success by extending its vision to their other products and innovating things even further. Although Apple was in a funk for the majority of the 90s, the one product that was doing really well for them at the time was their line of laptops called the PowerBook. In comparison, it was a huge upgrade to Apple's very first portable device, the Macintosh Portable from 1989, which was rather weak, unstable, very heavy, and incredibly expensive. It was a big flop for the company. So the PowerBook arrived in 1991, addressing many of these problems. It was much more powerful, lighter, thinner, and most importantly, much cheaper. The PowerBook sold very well, generating over $1 billion in revenue in just its first year. You would think that these kinds of numbers would have kept Apple afloat for some time, and it most certainly did, but there was still one problem. The PowerBook was a professional computer, and it was marketed as one. It was affordable, but by professional standards. For the everyday consumer, it was still very pricey. This meant that it really only targeted a niche audience within the market, so it wasn't exactly exercising its full potential. In fact, dividing up consumer and business products was rather common practice in the 90s, both with hardware and software. Now it's still relatively common now, but even more so back then. You even had business and consumer versions of Microsoft Windows, which both operated on entirely different kernels. After all, the biggest driving force to finding huge commercial success is by creating a product that appeals to everyone. It is very much a high-risk, high-reward approach. By focusing on niche markets, companies have a higher chance of finding moderate success within that specific demographic. By focusing on, well, the entire world, they now have a much smaller chance of succeeding, but when they do, the results are astronomical. The iMac did exactly this, and with its success, this distinction between the two markets was now even more tangible and clearer. But now the same needed to be done for their portable lineup. Steve Jobs at the 1999 Macworld Expo referred to this approach as their product matrix. The true way to finding huge success within this product ecosystem was by creating variations that satisfied all four of these possible arrangements. Their consumer products started with the prefix I, and their business products started with the prefix Power. Their desktop computers ended with Mac, and their laptops ended with Book, because, of course, they were so thin and portable, just like an actual book. So naturally, the consumer portable combination of this matrix would be called the iBook. Because this was a consumer product, Apple had to make some sacrifices on its hardware and overall capability. This had to be done for a multitude of reasons, but in many respects, this decision was both a blessing and a curse. Because the iBook was going to be marketed towards everyday people from a variety of backgrounds, it needed to be affordable. This meant that they needed to make the machine's hardware quite a bit weaker, as this was really the only way to lower production costs and have a desirable profit margin. As a result, the iBook was going to run into bottlenecks, performing the same tasks that the PowerBooks could do with relative ease. In other words, iBook users could not do as many things and were limited to rather basic computer activities. Having said that, it also didn't really matter. Many of the people who were buying iMacs and massively driving up sales were people who were buying computers for the very first time, and Apple was aware of this. These people didn't need the iMac for anything fancy, as it really served as more of a test drive for those who were browsing the internet for the first time on their own. As long as getting online was quick and easy, and they could still get the most out of it, that's really all they needed. All the other cool features were really just the cherry on top, a futuristic and aesthetically gorgeous way to pull someone in, to speak to them directly by saying, "Hey, I'm not just a machine, I get you." By sacrificing the fancy hardware of the PowerBook that tech novices didn't really care about, Apple could then direct their attention to other innovations that would be life-changing. For one, the iBook would have what Apple called all-day battery life, a whopping 6 hours of unplugged use. This was made possible in huge part by the hardware downgrades from the PowerBook line. Because iBooks were meant to operate as a daily driver for basic, lightweight activities, naturally it used way less energy, which made a 6-hour battery life very doable. Even charging it was a bit fun too, as you had this really cool looking adapter that was then nicknamed the hockey puck. Using small amounts of power also opened the door to another, quite controversial design choice that Apple just loved to do. The iBook did not have a fan. Steve Jobs famously hated putting fans inside of computers. They made them very loud, clunky, and oftentimes very thick to make room for them on the inside. It screamed factory and office appliance, rather than the beautiful, minimalist piece of furniture that Apple wanted its computers to be. This was historically something that tech enthusiasts regularly complained about, because it often meant sacrificing the full performance potential of the computer. Consequently, Apple machines throughout the 80s and 90s gained a rather notorious reputation for constantly overheating. Thankfully, the iBook was in a rather sweet spot, both design-wise and chronologically. The metal frame of the iBook's keyboard essentially acted as a heatsink that would absorb heat away from the processor while also pushing out any additional warm air through the vents and crevices it contained. This is known as passive cooling, given that by the late 90s, affordable computer hardware was finally strong enough to efficiently handle things like web browsing while also using minimal power. The iBook could more or less get away with this design. Now, of course, it wasn't foolproof. Many iBooks later down the line would run into hardware issues, like logic board failure and bad soldering that were worsened by overheating. But this became more of an issue long term. For the most part, the iBook's minimalist design and passive cooling was a success, and on top of its appearance, made it feel even more like a computer from the future. Much like the iMac, the iBook further rebelled against the overly professional and ugly computers of its time by being visually loud and vibrant, even in contrast to its PowerBook line, which was a lot darker and duller in comparison. The iBook even physically embodied the spirit of a personal computer by letting people make the personal choice of picking their own color. This color would even match the operating system's color palette fresh out of the box. This was something they could change at any time, but this setup emphasized maintaining a consistency that really spoke to the kind of familiar, warm, and welcoming vibe that a new computer user would want. This made things both more uniform and more fun, as the color was accented across many components of the exterior, in rubber and plastic form. You could argue that this, along with the iMac, really helped pioneer that unique Y2K aesthetic that began popping up everywhere at this time. Apple's software would adopt a very similar appearance shortly after, with its famous Aqua design. The iBook kept a trackpad that was virtually identical to the PowerBooks in capability, but included a button that matched the color of your machine. At least it wasn't the dreaded trackball. Maybe it's just the ignorant youth in me, but how can anyone use that? The computer's overall shape was also really fascinating, given that it was primarily designed to comfortably sit inside a student backpack. Its unusually round and polished shape is what gave it the nickname the clamshell, and the software was the pearl inside. Although macOS 8 and 9 were rather pedestrian compared to the massively supported Windows 9 X OS of the time, and by an even larger extent, the soon-to-be-released OS X, iBook's native software did have something very special: ease of access to the internet. This was, to no surprise, very important to have by the end of the 90s, as the internet was snowballing in popularity. Getting online needed to be easy. Because Windows machines came in a variety of shapes and forms in terms of hardware and software support, iMac was famously an all-in-one device that was immediately ready to go. Because these Macs all had the same setup and environment fresh out of the box, users didn't need to figure out what internet setup wizard or drivers they needed for their hardware and ISP. Apple took care of all of that for you. As they famously put it, the instructions for setting up an iMac were very simple. Step 1, plug it in. Step 2, get connected. Step 3, well, there is no step 3. It was that easy. With the iMac, you could take it out of the box and be on the World Wide Web in less than 10 minutes. The iBook was no exception. In fact, it made this process somehow even easier by introducing something so revolutionary that its influence is still a regular part of our digital lives. As we all know, if you wanted to get online in the 90s, you needed to plug your laptop into a modem with an Ethernet cable. But that meant you were generally trapped into one spot to work. Seems rather stationary for a supposedly portable device. Instead of plugging into an Ethernet cable, what if you plugged your laptop into nothing? Your Ethernet port was the air. An airport, as Apple coined it, and it was the very first consumer product to commercially use a technology called Wi-Fi. You've probably heard people say that Wi-Fi is short for wireless fidelity, but it actually isn't. In fact, it doesn't mean anything. It was a word created in 1999 by Interbrand, simply because they thought it sounded cool. Now, I want to save the full history and technique of Wi-Fi as its own separate video. But in short, prior to the iBook, it was really just a niche and experimental technology mostly found in laboratories and research environments. In very simple terms, Apple Airport brought Wi-Fi to the iBook through radio modulation. The airport card that was inside the iBook would use the computer's built-in antennas to talk to a nearby airport base station. This was a device that plugged into your modem, and it effectively acted as a translator. It would take the modem's Ethernet signals and translate them into radio signals. The airport card in your iBook would listen for these signals and translate them back into data that you could now see and hear. Now, the airport base station and card were both things that you had to buy separately, but once you did, it felt like magic. In fact, Steve Jobs famously showcased this during the 1999 Macworld Expo by running a hula hoop through the laptop while connecting it. Now, you might be thinking, this technology sounds very basic in its functionality. Why did it take until 1999 for Apple to popularize it with Airport? And that is, once again, a conversation for another video all about Wi-Fi. The iBook was the personal computer's evolutionary step in personality, customization, and groundbreaking technology. A message that was quickly carried on through movies, TV, and just pop culture in general over the next several years. iMac was the push that Apple needed. iBook was the moment the company said with great conviction that things were never going to be the same again. If you would like to learn more about the history of the iMac, you can check out my video on that right here. A special thanks to my Patreon supporters. Check out patreon.com/nationsquid for ad-free videos and exclusive content. Also be sure to check out my second channel all about the history of the Beatles. A coffee is always appreciated too. Thank you for watching, everyone.